Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for the last lecture in the Aga Khan Program for Islamic Architecture series for this fall. My name is Huma Gupta, and I'm assistant professor in the Aga Khan program. First, I just wanted to take a minute and thank all of you who've been attending our programs regularly, also those who joined us for the reception of the Out of Antiquity exhibition curated by Nasser Abbat and Professor Francesca Leoni. It's still open if you'd like to see it until December 19th. I also wanted to bring your attention to another talk that Nasser is giving this Wednesday in the Bush Room. It's titled Visualizing Arabic, the Import of Inscriptions in Islamic Architecture, so we hope to see you there. And looking forward to the spring semester, Professors Rabat, Azraq Shamia, and I, with our program assistant Diana Rooney, are currently formulating an exciting lineup, which will include talks by the Palestinian architect, visual artist, and founder of Hollow Form Studio, Dima Suruji, our Aga Khan Fellows, Aslihan Gunhan, and Rafat Marzoub, who will be joined by Nicholas Fayyad of East Architecture Studio, in addition to a film screening program. We will share more details for these events in coming weeks, so stay tuned. Now, it's my exceeding honor to introduce our guest for tonight, Professor Zainab Bahrani, who is the Edith Porada Professor and Chair of the Department of Art History and Archaeology at Columbia University in New York. And she is also the director of the Bahdinan Mosul Gate Conservation Project in Iraqi Kurdistan and the Mapping Mesopotamian Monuments Project in Iraq and Turkey. So I reached out to Dr. Bahrani in the spring to invite her because selfishly, her scholarship had been deeply influential in shaping the introduction to my current book project, which actually focuses on migrant settlements in the 20th century. Though I'm neither an art historian nor an archaeologist, I found that Dr. Bahrani's scholarship, her intellectual framing and theories of representation of ancient non-Western aesthetics and arts, on the origins of writing, Orientalist epistemology, her engagement with Derridian theory, and the way in which she sort of counters traditional notions of metaphysics as having far-reaching implications beyond the specific geographical context and time period that she studies. And this sentiment, or I should say sense of awe, was shared by all of the graduate students in my Archive Fever seminar this semester who read her, and some who reread her, excerpts from her 2003 book, The Graven Image, Representation in Babylonia and Assyria. I think one reason for the potency of her scholarship is how Dr. Bahrani analyzes the geographical construction of Mesopotamia as a sort of discursive map or simulacrum that forces us as historians into a reflexive mode where we're forced to confront how historical truths are mediated in part by the relationship that the historian has to the deep past. And while I might be partial to the Graven Image at the moment, Dr. Bahrani is a prolific writer, and some of her other books include the 2001 Women of Babylon, Gender and Representation Mesopotamia, which was published by Routledge, her 2008 Rituals of War, published by Zone and MIT Press, which won the American Historical Association Prize, her 2014 The Infinite Image, Art, Time, and Aesthetic Dimension in Antiquity, published by the University of Chicago, which won the Lionel Trilling Prize, among many others. But her most recent work is a book called War Essays, which will be available through UCL Press in January of 2025. And the book reflects on more than 2 decades after the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2001, charting the devastation, cultural cleansing, and targeted erasure of Iraq's past, and historicizes both the position of the historian and enduring colonial practices of archaeology. With that, please welcome Dr. Bahrani with a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Huma, for that introduction. It's very kind of you. And thank you all for inviting me to speak here today. It's very nice to be among a group of colleagues, perhaps now more than ever before, to be able to speak about things that we care about and that we feel strongly about. So I don't take it for granted. I very much appreciate having you here to listen to this work and hopefully to discuss afterwards. So I will begin with the first slide. And the first thing I want to do is explain that what I wanted to do tonight was to take the opportunity to present to you Amediye and our recent work there, but that rather than keeping to the standard format of archaeological description, what I'd like to do is to speak about the kind of intellectual work that can emerge from such projects, and which can contribute, I think, to the larger task of decolonizing histories of architecture and of archaeology. So I will present Amediye as a case study, not only to recount our work there over the past few years, but as a site to think with, if I can borrow that phrase from Claude Lévi-Strauss. As a site to think with about the intersection of fieldwork, landscape, archives, which is what you're thinking about, and the writing of history. So Amediye is not an archaeological tell or mound, but the site of strikingly visible antiquities among which people go about their daily lives. Entanglement and encounters with antiquities forming the habitus of lived experience and one's sense of place in the world. Reflections on ruins and practices of architectural preservation have, as this audience knows perhaps better than others, they have long been characterized as distinctive preoccupations to be understood historically within intellectual and political contexts of modern Europe. A romantic reflection on ruins and antiquities. However, archaeologists working in former colonized lands or under informal imperialism are increasingly contesting this view. In more recent years, as a result of extensive archival research and the reading of colonial archives against the grain, alternative or indigenous archaeologies and earlier forms of relationships to the past have begun to receive more serious scholarly attention as a way to challenge dominant top-down histories that are written from the perspective of state or imperial archives and result in a limited orbit of knowledge. Towards this effort to unsettle the discursive dominance of colonial archaeology and its archives, I turn to the archive within the field. The landscape of tells and ruins and of historical architecture in Iraq reveals long-term tangible evidence of historical preservation and conservation practices that we have been studying. In the midst of the practical activities of fieldwork, theoretical reflection can open up new directions for decolonizing a fundamentally colonial field. And they can call into question its ruptures and fragmentations. Some of these questions and concerns arose in my research many, many years ago, at first anchored in post-colonial theory and historiography, but now also in my fieldwork. They arose precisely because of the internal conflict that I have had to contend with as an Iraqi working in a field that, like anthropology, was developed in the service of European imperialism and its forays into our lands. Archaeology is a territorial intervention. I don't mean to suggest, of course, that archaeology or ancient Near Eastern studies, however colonial in their formation, have not contributed significantly to scientific knowledge, to the decipherment of ancient scripts, or the classification and taxonomies of artifacts. They have made great strides, to be sure, but in doing so, they have nevertheless neglected, disparaged, or dismissed other forms of historical knowledge. The emergence of this field expanded the impressive range of Western scholarship, but it was always accompanied by dispossession and the destruction of knowledge systems. The material or empirical evidence in the landscape is another means to move to a future remaking of archaeological writing that encounters entrenched and seemingly unshakable divisions and narratives of unenlightened natives, ignorant of their own past and requiring the intervention of a civilizing mission. Both heritage destruction and colonial narratives erase and rewrite histories. An archaeology of preservation practices can look at other forms of evidence. It can become a source for constituting an archive of resistance against historical erasure and ethnic cleansing, a project that seems more urgent than ever today in the midst of the current war. Archaeological work, I argue, can be turned to such activists' refusals of imperial colonial narratives of Iraq and elsewhere in the region. My aim is to begin to lay out an argument about the ways in which the work of architectural preservation and its intersection with archaeological methods can become a place to open new directions of thinking beyond earlier standardized colonial narratives that remain in place, having themselves become a form of deposit in the land. The archive within the landscape can augment and substantiate the archival and theoretical work of decolonization, turning archaeology against the grain, so to speak. Already with envisioning the Mapping Mesopotamian Monuments project that I initiated 12 years ago, I wanted to not simply catalog or inventory structures, but to study the landscape today, close up and in the longue durée. Current perceptual modalities and methods don't generally allow for this kind of intimate process of walking and looking and reflecting upon these processes as one goes. This evening, I want to speak about the intellectual rather than the technical methods of our work at Amediye. They include the insistence on this longue durée view, on the physical and the material context of the historical monuments in wider landscapes and environments, and the lived and embodied experience of being there within heights and depths, the sense of the infinite and the time of the mountains themselves. I want to pause for a minute for a word on the pronunciation, because some of you may be wondering about this. In Arabic, the name of the city that I'm talking about this evening is Al-Amadiye. In official Kurdish, it's Amedi, but in the local Kurdish pronunciation of the city itself, it's Amediye. So in the city itself and the environs around it, the small towns and villages around it, they say Amediye. So they neither say Amedi nor Al-Amadiye. And for that reason, I'm going to stick with that pronunciation today, using the most local form of the pronunciation. A monumental stone portal gives entry into Amediye from the direction of the road to Mosul. Carved with a mythical scene above the arched entry, the portal, its sculpture, and its contextual setting are remarkable for several reasons. Amediye is a citadel high up in the mountains of Iraqi Kurdistan, close to the modern border with Turkey. It rises on a magnificent rocky height, visible across the landscape from a far distance. And it stands between the peaks of the Metin and the Gara mountains, commanding spectacular views of the Zagros over opulent orchards of pomegranates and fig trees below. Nearby, in Sarsenk and above Gara, summer palaces were built by the Hashemite king Faisal during the British Mandate period, and by Saddam Hussein later in the century. Amediye itself is historically best known, perhaps, as the seat of the powerful Bahdinan Emirate, a semi-autonomous Kurdish principality that flourished under the Ottoman Empire. Amediye was constructed as an elliptically shaped citadel that utilizes the natural defenses of a steep and formidable ascent. In the 13th century AD, 2 portals were the only points of entry, and the remains of these stand today in various states of preservation. One was known as the Mosul Gate and is now referred to as the Bahdinan Gate, and the second was the Zibari Gate, which was destroyed in the 20th century. The cause is not clear. The archival documents and the historical accounts about the Zibari Gate are contradictory on this matter. However, much of the retaining wall of the Zibari Gate still stands. So the lower image is the Zibari Gate, and on the left we've superimposed a historical photograph on top of the way that it looks today. So the gate is missing, but we used a historical photograph from the end of the 19th century and superimposed it to show where it would have been. So the information is contradictory, but we have that one photograph. And the retaining wall next to it, I don't have a pointer, but I think you can just make it out. The retaining wall is still intact and is in good condition. The Mosul Gate at the top, on the other hand, retains much of its original structure and remains in place where we have been working for several years. So for several years, I've been directing this joint team of Columbia University and the Kurdistan Archaeology Organization. And this site, I'll say from the start, I take to be and argue was an integral historical site that spans the pre-Islamic and the Islamic era in ways that contradict our scholarly preconceptions. While describing the work that we have been doing, I will begin to lay out the ways in which these fieldwork methods can be turned to the counter-narratives that challenge colonial archives and after effects on our land, which, as the anthropologist Anne Stoller says, remain as imperial debris. My argument is based on this work at Amediye, but also on my earlier work at Babylon, the site, which was a site that was under U.S. military occupation in 2003 and 2004. As I have said, the labor that takes place in dismantling or unsettling of earlier narratives consists not only in the archival and the textual work that we do, it depends also on the tangible and the material evidence that we can read in the archives and the terrain. The ruined site becomes a place for remaking archaeological knowledge for a future that is no longer anchored in colonial definitions and discourses, although by necessity it will always be irrevocably tied to this disciplinary coloniality. So the Mosul Gate is reached by a rather steep and winding ascent from the valley below. After a sharp turning, the paved path of ancient steps leads to the portal. Here we see the monumental portal of large limestone blocks bordered by a rectangular inscription frame in Arabic. And I think you can just make out on the left the outer frame. Within the main part of the portal, about halfway up, an inner frame is formed by a linear band, a band that at the springing line of the arch winds itself into an angular voussoir pattern. A sunburst in the form of a solar disk with facial features surrounded by a double nimbus of rays encircled by a band of spirals is placed above the keystone. Below it is a rosette. In the spandrels of the arch, on the right and on the left, we see long-haired and bearded heroes battling winged horned dragons with goat-like foreparts and serpentine tails. This hybrid creature is similar to the goatfish of ancient Babylonia, known from the end of the 3rd millennium BC until the Hellenistic period, and associated with the god Ea or Enki and with astrological emblems. The masculine heroes are richly dressed in slightly differing costumes, tunics and trousers, one with a longer coat-like garment embroidered with stars, so that despite the heraldic symmetry, they are not exactly mirror images of one another. Upon closer inspection, it appears that the winged horned goats and are the foreparts of the dragon, whose tails merge into the spiral design and become part of the framing scene. The heroes step upon this ground line created by the dragon's serpentine tails. At the same time, the ground line also seems to come out of the branches below, from which the background foliage that fills the space in between also emerges. So this, as you can see from the photograph on the upper left, which was its condition before we started the work, was a bit jumbled up. The image on the right is the older black and white photograph, shows how the scene and the gate looked before the collapse. Our main task became the task of restoring this sculptured relief. That's why we came to the site in the first place, because it had fallen and was repositioned and the scene could no longer be read. Sometime in the late 1960s or the start of the 1970s, the gate collapsed as a result of constant level seismic activity here, but perhaps also in combination with destabilization caused by aerial bombardments in the region that are, by the way, still ongoing today. At the collapse, only the left column of limestone blocks remained standing in place at the east side. The structure was then restored. In the early 1980s, a somewhat haphazard reconstruction took place, placing collapsed pieces in wrong locations in the spandrels, building the roofing and the west side. This was followed by more restorations in 1997 that filled in gaps and plastered surfaces. The flawed restoration was confusing, especially for seeing the iconographic detail. As we began our own work to take down and reconstruct this jumbled restoration, we turned to historical research and early 20th century photography. The German archaeologist Walter Bachmann was in Ottoman Iraq just before the breakout of the First World War in 1911, and he photographed the gate. Bachmann's photograph is on the left. And he also photographed the rock reliefs next to it, which I will show you in due course. We were able to locate his original photographs in the archives of the Vorderasiatische Museum in Berlin. One of these images, the one on the left, was of such high quality that we were able to use it as a guideline for restoring the relief blocks to their original locations so that the iconography could be seen. But of course, photography raises other interpretive issues. the idea of the mechanical apparatus guaranteeing objectivity, the way of seeing and framing that creates monuments, the archaeological vision that removes context and people. The photograph is evidence of a moment, but it has to be read, of course. We combine this research in the archives with constant conversations with the community. We talk to elders living in the town for stories of the gate, the event of its collapse, and the sequence of restorations that they had witnessed through the years. In the process, we heard many stories about war and histories of violence, but also memories and stories about the gate itself, the time that the great wooden doors of the portals were closed. You can see the wooden doors in the left-hand image still intact in that 1911 image, and you can see them on the lower right in the 1940s image still in the scene. So they spoke about the gate through the decades. They spoke about their memories of the portals, of the wooden doors, when they would open and when they would close, and how the great wooden portals were closed at times in order to protect the citizens of Amediye, and the times when, finally, of the time when they were removed, never to be seen again. The closest parallel to our portal is a gate near Sinjar, dated by inscription to the reign of Bedreddin Lu'lu'. There we see heroes slaying similar dragons, though the tales have more knots and twists. Talismanic gates and dragons, lions and so on, are not unusual in the Seljuk period, including in Baghdad and Mosul, but also in places like Aleppo and Konya. The colonial officer and aspiring archaeologist Gertrude Bell photographed much of the region, including the Sinjar Gate you see here on the upper right, but she apparently never reached Amediye. One of Bell's contemporaries, a British High Commissioner of Iraq, Sir Henry Dobbs, describes warfare between Turkish and British troops, which resulted in the massacre and displacement of 8,000 Assyrian Christians from the highlands into the valley. And during the Mesopotamia campaign, Amediye was the site of an anti-British insurrection, which was followed, in typical fashion, by intensive punitive strikes by Britain. These are the violent events that kept Bell away, although she neglects to mention them in her writings. Even these stories of the insurrection were recounted by some who pointed to the locations in the landscape as sites of bombardment and battle, as they repeated the tales of their grandfathers here. Several early 20th century archaeologists were in the region, such as Hertzfeld and Saar, but as they followed the course of the Tigris to Diyarbakir rather than going northward to Amediye, they didn't actually come here. The exception, interestingly enough, was Mark Sykes of the Sykes-Picot agreement. Mark Sykes traveled through here on an espionage mission just before the First World War and wrote about it. So when the gate collapsed in the early 20th century, there was little documentation to work with, as archaeologists had not generally come through here, instead following the line of the passage of the Tigris River. The haphazard restorations of the 1980s and the 1990s have been widely criticized by many. But as we continued to work here, I actually gained a new respect for our predecessors. They had no earlier architectural plans. The gate had never been studied. No drawings, no plans, no photographic documentation to guide their work. They did not have access to the archives that we had access to. If they had not built the fallen blocks back into the arch, however haphazardly, the original blocks would have been lost. The gate itself became a repository for the original materials that were preserved for us by the earlier restoration. And we were soon to find several more interventions from past times along these lines. Although the settlement is probably far older, the archaeological evidence on this site dates to the Parthian dynasty, so that is 247 BC to 227 AD. This dynasty is known for its battles against the Roman Empire's incursions into Mesopotamia, and Parthian remains are found throughout Iraq, both north and south. By the Middle Ages, early scholars such as Yaqut al-Rumi al-Hamawi and Ali Az-Din ibn al-Athir wrote about Amediye, describing it as an ancient site. According to Yaqut al-Rumi, writing in his encyclopedic geographic volumes between 1224 and 1228 AD, Amediye was built in 537 Hijra by Imad ad-Din Zengi, and that the name Amediye is after that name, of the name of this emir. However, according to both Yaqut and Ibn al-Athir, the Zengid citadel was not an entirely new city. They both say that it was built on an earlier Kurdish fortification called Ashib. What is interesting here in their remark is that the name Ashib is in fact an ancient Akkadian word for dwelling or town or residential seat of power. It indicates that the settlement here goes back perhaps to the Assyrian period or earlier. Some version of this name must have been in continuing use before the time of these medieval writers, and must have been commonly enough known for them to record it. Considering the ancient remains here, the remark about Ashib is significant. The name indicates the existence of a settlement that predates the archaeological evidence that we can see in front of us. Archaeologists have not been aware of the earlier name because scholars of the ancient Near East don't read much in Islamic history. Conversely, Islamic historians have no familiarity with Akkadian. The disciplinary divide is entrenched, and this is an obstacle that is part of a larger ideological division and research paradigm in which coloniality remains in the discussion of ancient Mesopotamian antiquity from the land and its the constant dissociation of this antiquity from the land and its people, with its historical narrative directed elsewhere. Yet along with the neglected Arabic sources and the ancient toponyms, the continuous presence of ruins and monuments is clear. I say continuous in order to underscore the constant state of becoming and being that is the ontological nature of such monuments, as I have argued elsewhere. And this is something that can be observed even though ideological partition has led to other consequences, to acts of violence and ethnocentric claims and attempts to erase the past. Thus, both Arabic historical evidence of the 13th century and archaeological evidence on site reveal that there was an ancient town here that predates Imad ad-Din. The rock reliefs at the entrance of the citadel, which I will describe in due course, date to the 1st century BC AD. At that time, Amediye was part of the kingdom of Adiabene, which was within the Parthian sphere of influence. After 224, it became part of the Sasanian Empire. After Imad ad-Din's constructions, the entrance was rebuilt and adorned with the decoration of the arch, and the gate bears the inscription, now no more because part of it collapsed, but enough of it remains to be read. And the gate bears an inscription of Bedruddin Lu'lu on the outer frame, and it bears his royal titles. It's a series of royal titles glorifying this emir. Bedruddin Lu'lu was the Atabeg and regent of the Zengid dynasty. In 1225, he united a number of cities, including Mosul and Amediye, and ruled what later became the independent Bahdinan Emirate. This ruler traced his origin to Baha'u'ddin, who was himself said to be a descendant of the Abbasids. Bedruddin Lu'lu is also known to have surrendered to the Mongols in order to avoid destruction of the city of Mosul. He ruled what later became the Bahdinan Emirate, as I have just mentioned, and this became the seat of power, a seat of power for him. At its height, the Bahdinan Emirate encompassed a swathe of territory that included Zakho, Dahok, and Accra. Remains of the Bahdinan Palace and the Royal Cemetery still stands, and on the left you can see the cemetery on the lower left and the part of the palace towards the right, the palace entrance. The rest was destroyed in the early 20th century. When the Ottoman writer Awliya Çelebi traveled through the region of the Pashalik of Baghdad in 1655, he left a memorable and somewhat amusing description of the Bahdinan Principality in his Sayahatnameh, describing its magnificent hospitality and delicious food, both of which I can happily attest to myself are still intact today. In the 19th century, a few Western travelers referred to it briefly in their travel books, giving some further information. We began our restoration work on the portal, but also on the rock reliefs and stairway path, a path integral to the site. We completed a thorough baseline documentation with various forms of digital imaging and measured line drawings, plans, elevations, and sections, photogrammetry, and so on, drone-based imagery, all of the toolbox of archaeologists that we usually use. The structure of the gate had not yet been studied, and it was an extremely sensitive project for several reasons. The main problem was that the gate had collapsed, but this was not just a matter of the jumbled iconography that needed rearrangement. Most of the structure had fallen, though the east side, as I said, remained standing. It had been restored with the pieces put in the wrong place. But there was also a sheer crack on the east side that threatened to collapse the entirety of the gate, including the only ancient wall that remained in place. To start with, we identified two sculptors, Adar Jabr and Rashid Ali, and a master mason, Khairi Abdul Hakim. All of them were able to work following traditional methods of work in stone. From the stonemasons in particular, we all learned a great deal about traditional tools that are still in use, as well as a great deal about quarrying, the production of mortar, and building techniques. These are aspects of our project that became part of a larger study of technologies, of materials and methods, of working traditions, and of sites. For example, we note that the quarries are also archaeological sites that are still in use today. These methods are not to be found in texts, of course, but are passed down among skilled workers, some of whom were apprenticed since childhood with elders. Among the oldest of the stonemasons, our master mason, or usta, Kak Khairi, who you can see is the gray gentleman on the left. Kak Khairi's knowledge was deep and impressive, though he is non-literate, as were other stonemasons before him. This knowledge is not written or archived, but learned through practice. As I watched and learned from the stonemasons, it became clear that this practice was often silent instruction that involved rhythmic repetition of movement and often in pairs. It was an embodied knowledge learned and passed from one generation to the next, along with stories and tales of stone and stonework, architectural construction and rituals associated with that construction that Kak Khairi talked about and which we listened to eagerly. Although we were under pressure from some factions to import materials and methods, we wanted to follow traditional methods as much as possible and whenever we could. At the same time, our archival research in the archives of the State Board of Antiquities and the Iraq Museum in Baghdad and at the Vorder Asiatische in Berlin allowed us to find a number of unpublished photographs that became a visual guide for our work as well. I also reached out to friends and colleagues who had visited Amediye right before the first Gulf War in 1991. Two of them had some tourist snapshots that they feared might not be helpful, but in fact they were very useful for our work because they showed clearly the state of the 1980s restoration, and we could compare the work that was added in 1997. So we began to chart the different states and restorations of the gate through the decades. Encountering a number of structural problems as we did our work, we had to think how to fix these without taking down the only column of masonry that had not collapsed, and that's the one that you see on the upper right on the left, just to remind you that column had not collapsed, and we didn't mind taking down the arch because it had already collapsed, but we hoped that we didn't have to take down the one column that had remained in place through everything. So that was our challenge. Among the problems that we had to contend with was this lateral shear crack on the east side of the gate that threatened the whole structure. So a couple of seasons were devoted also to micromorphological testing of mortar and stone. We spent some time identifying the right quarry for our stone. We worked with geologists from the University of Mosul who joined us for the testing and analysis and identifying the right quarry. After some searching in the area, we were able to identify a place called Geli Darash as a source for our stone. And then came the slow and careful removal of the blocks. We created a pulley and rail system with chains and hoists that led to our storage areas using repurposed materials. So the pulley and chain system and everything used repurposed materials. We continuously experimented with recipes for binder and fill using local methods and material. The traditional mortars are created from the environment, sometimes mixtures of the natural and the built together, either rocky limestone outcrop, but also parts of discarded blocks of stone are repurposed. As we conducted our work of dismantling, we soon found that there were much earlier repairs inside the gate also, which seemed to be of the Ottoman era. Iron pins had been used to strengthen and hold together blocks precisely in the same location that we found to be weakened in our own work. So people before us had contended with exactly the same issues that we were dealing with centuries before us. We had already noted that a wooden shim had been inserted in between some of the blocks at the east side at some point, and we had noted it already in the 1911 photograph. I don't know if you can make it out. I'll just point here quickly. But there's a wooden shim that's inserted right there. And it was in the 1911 photograph, and it remained in place. So that, too, was an earlier attempt at doing repairs here. We erected scaffolding using repurposed beams from the industrial zone outside of the city of Duhok, which is the nearest big city to Amediye. And then, after bringing the materials to the site and setting up our scaffolding, we discovered that we had inadvertently bought, and repurposed German and Carnegie steel railroad beams that had been used for the Berlin-Baghdad Railroad and that had been in constant circulation in Iraq for well over a century. So from before the First World War. This was a happy discovery because I had just received a major grant from the Carnegie Foundation, which supported some of our work. Of course, much of the bricolage and repurposing and reuse is typical of Iraq. And this is something that we don't talk about, and we should. So bricolage and repurposing is very, very typical of Iraq. And why is that the case? It's because of the decades of embargo, because of decades and embargo and war that cut it off from the world. But the creative uses and bricolage has also become a method of its own, from which we can learn about earlier forms of repurposing and reuse in this area. In dismantling the frieze, we uncovered the large area of loose rubble of masonry on the inside of the gate, which had been a cause of the destabilization for some time. And it now posed an immediate hazard. It had become even worse since we began the work, and it was now a hazard for our crew and our team as well. So we consolidated it with sacrificial mortar until we could continue our work. And in the process, as we were doing this, we found a block with a missing dragon's head buried inside the gate. Inserted inside the gate into the rubble masonry. And on the upper left, you see the hero's head, and in front of him, the goat's head of the dragon on the left side of the spandrel. And this is our own restoration. So this is after we took it down and we put it back up, we inserted that goat's head back in place where it belonged because we found it inserted into the rubble inside the gate in a much earlier restoration or preservation project. I should say preservation, not restoration. Around the same time, just living and working in Amediye as we were one long hot summer, living there led us again inadvertently, to another block of stone, which turned out to be quite remarkable. It was near the old Zibari gate, and it was inscribed. We documented it and studied the inscription, and of course we turned it into the Directorate of Antiquities, but the text states clearly that it was part of the restoration project of Sultan Othman. Those of you who can read Arabic, maybe you can see it. So this is the block as we found it. At the top is the drawing that we made to be able to read the text better, and you can see that it says Rammam al-Sultan Uthman Beg Lena Bab al-Mana, etc., etc. So for those of you who don't know Arabic, it's clearly talking about a restoration preservation project. So this is from the Ottoman period, and we can talk about which Uthman. I don't know. You Islamicists can help us out here, because there were three of them, right? So it's one of the three Uthmans. To return to our portal, as one approaches by way of the winding ascent from the valley, one encounters a series of rock reliefs. Because Amediye was not on the usual route, these two were not studied as they should have been, but they were obviously very well known locally, as they are very clear to the entrance of the citadel, and everybody passes by them every single day, several times a day. So they were not in any way unknown to people locally, although scholarship had long neglected them, had not really dealt with them much. The rock reliefs are distributed along the ascent as one climbs up the steep path from the valley. The first thing that you see is this relief, and it's as you go up this steep path, you make a turn, and after making a 90-degree turn, you see a relief placed in a niche. It's 2.21 meters tall, so that's over 7 feet in height. And although the surface is worn, we can see here a striding male figure. Oops. No, that's the wrong one. This is what I wanted. We can see here a striding male figure. Well, maybe you could see it better before. Yeah. Facing towards the direction of the citadel. Before him, he has something in his hand, and he appears to be holding a spear as he walks, and he wears a band or a fillet. So, of course, we studied these, we cleaned them, we treated them, we studied them, and recorded them and documented them with photogrammetry, and studied them carefully. The second relief is this, and it's in the middle of the path as one goes up. And it's the most worn out, is 2.35 meters high, and it probably represents a female figure, which we could see upon studying the surface very closely and more carefully. And I would cautiously suggest that it might have been an image of Alat Athena, for example, with her clothing, with a garment that's pleated and a shield at her foot. The first figure appears to be a warrior or a prince walking up towards the citadel entrance. And the one that's closest to the gate is also the largest. It's 2.81 meters, so over 9 feet tall, and it represents a frontally positioned male figure in a bit of a contrapposto stance. He holds a large standard or a staff in his right hand, held upwards, and in his left we see two different swords. One is curved to the left, and the other one with a rounded pommel is visible and hangs along the side of his leg. He has thick curly tufts of hair and wears a fillet with flowing ribbons at his head. There are good Parthian parallels for this kind of male figure. but the flowing ribbons may also be a bit reminiscent of Sasanian images at the same time. Every day, a series of Amediye farmers go up and down this path to the valley and come back up with produce, with pomegranates, with figs, with other produce from the orchards, carried up by donkeys. Every day they climb up and down with alongside these reliefs and go in and out of the gate that we were working on. The three reliefs are the first things that one encounters upon approach from the valley below. So we cleaned and treated the reliefs, but we also mapped, cleaned, and stabilized the stairs, which also date to the Parthian period, so that means they're about 2,000 years old, and they are perhaps the oldest monumental stairs in the region. In our team, we were all against the idea of sectioning off the stairs as a heritage path that could no longer be used by the people or by the animals. In our work here, we were pushed by some factions to think about this, but all of us pushed against the notion, all of us on the team, pushed against the notion of museumification, because museumification has taken over several locations in Iraq already. Here's another image of produce and farmers going in and out. Our study of the rock surfaces of these three reliefs indicates that they were not effaced, but eroded with time. The relief closest to the portal is the one that's best preserved because of its location. It's not as exposed to the elements as the other two further down the path. So the 13th century gate and the Zengid fortifications were constructed without any attempt to remove these ancient reliefs that are so highly visible next to the main entrance and as you come up from the valley. The blocks of the 13th century gate were inserted in such a way as to consider the location of the first relief and incorporate it into the larger composition of the entryway into the citadel. All three reliefs were seamlessly integrated into the Islamic fortification. Not only did the Zengid architects leave the reliefs in place, they were also guided by the reliefs to follow the original approach. They left the Parthian reliefs in place as powerful images from the past that were determinately composed into the gate. The prince then commissioned his own sculptures of bearded heroes on the spandrels above the gate, which are the ones that we fixed and restored, in order to protect the entrance. The Parthian reliefs were thus neither disregarded nor were they utilized for some structural purpose. They were kept in place at the entry as a continuous presence. In fact, they became the inspiration for the new fortress outline and adopted the Parthian reliefs and created their own imagery in dialogue with that past. What we can observe then is that this is an image world that is both ancient and Islamic at the same time. So an image world that is ancient and Islamic makes up the realm of representation here. The gate iconography draws upon the iconographies of the past. The afterlives of ancient images were purposely integrated into the Islamic acropolis, thus collapsing temporal boundaries. In theoretical terms, and linked at the same time to the embodied practices and observations of our Mapping Mesopotamian Monuments work, my argument and conclusions are as follows. A monument is in a constant state and process of becoming. It resists time, but it is also adapted to new temporalities and meanings. Contradictory in its temporal presence, it both stands as a trace of the past, of event and moment, while being constant and timeless. The archive, the skilled knowledge, the evidence of ancient restoration and preservation, The quarry, the hewing of stones, the carving of stones are all part of the larger mapping work and recognition of systems of knowledge that we have lost. The monuments and the tells are part of the landscape, the rocks and the cliffs. Tales grew around them of mythical and historical times. If we read them well, they tell us a different story about our relationship to the past. Thank you, and I would like to thank all of you, as well as my colleagues on the team, and those, the people of Amediye who supported our work there. Thank you.
Would you like to?
I am happy to answer questions if somebody has one.
Thank you, Dr. Bahrani. I'm really interested in photography and archaeology and your use of these historical photographs, but also your team's kind of multimodal documentation efforts of your own work. And so I'm wondering if you can say more about how you, were thinking about your engagement with these photographs, given the differing kind of mediations that you talk about at one point, and how, if at all, that kind of understanding of photography may have shaped your own use of the practice, or thinking about the kind of future archive of this work in this moment.
Thank you for that question, and I'm glad that you asked it, because much of our work, both in this project and in the larger project, Mapping Mesopotamian Monuments, which is much wider and encompasses a greater area, has involved photographic documentation and digital documentation, photogrammetry, all of these things. And of course we use these, and we are kind of obsessive in our collection of photographic details, and also in our archival work, where we try to collect as much as we can, or find as much as we can, archival photographs from the past, from the 19th century, from the early 20th century, and pull them all together. At the same time, we remain very well aware that this kind of documentation is certainly not neutral. It brings with it numerous problems that have to be taken into account and considered. And we don't work with these technologies or with these forms of representation in any way kind of simply thinking that these are the answer. We're constantly aware of the fact, for example, that Bachmann's photographs or other early photographs are part and parcel of imperialism in our lands. And as I said at the very start, we want to do a kind of an archaeology, but an archaeology against the grain, if I can kind of use that or paraphrase that expression, to do an archaeology against the grain, where we use the technologies and methods of archaeology but try to turn them against themselves, because archaeology is always going to be a colonial discipline. It always was, and that's not going to change. So I think what we need to do is to acknowledge our discipline and the histories of our discipline, and work within our disciplines, knowing those, and to try to turn them against themselves. In the same way that colleagues who are working extensively, historians who work in the archives, do use the imperial archives, but read it against the grain. So I think that it's just a matter of historical criticism, isn't it? Whether one is using visual representation or written texts. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you for that talk. Very enjoyable, commendable. I have a question more about the iconography of the two warriors. First, do they have mustaches or
Yes.
just beards?
Both.
Okay. Well, that's very interesting.
Oh, is it?
Well, yes. So, and they have very distinctive clothing. So, what is your take on these characters?
On who they are. Well, there are some similar images to this, and it's some people have said Khidr Ilyas. You know, I don't know how to explain Khidr Ilyas. He's a kind of a mythical character, hero. Some have associated this character with the kind of a Saint George and the Dragon type. Some have associated this character because there are two of them, left and right, and they're both fighting the dragon, but the dragon is in fact one dragon. It's an amazing scene. The dragon is in fact one dragon. I'm going to see if I can find the drawing because I think it's fantastic. Can you make out that drawing? So there are two of them, and they're fighting the one two-headed dragon, and the dragon becomes the abstract design of the gate. It's just an incredible design. The other explanation for this character, besides Khidr Ilyas and St. George, is that it is a hero from the Nowruz story, Kaveh. So in the Nowruz story, what happens is that there is a horrible serpent king. Well, he's a king, and serpents grow out of his shoulders, and he asks for human sacrifice from the people who live in the land, and he is despotic, and he has taken over the land and made life miserable for everybody. And then this hero comes to fight him and defeats him. And so this hero is associated with defeating the Serpent King and the dragon. And when that defeat is final and the horrible Zahak is killed, then they light fires on the mountaintops to let the people and the villages and the towns know that it's safe to come out. So that's the story of Nowruz, and that's why they light the fires on the mountaintops and everywhere. One of the explanations is that this also references the Nowruz story, and it's also in the Shahnameh, by the way, in the Persian mythology, in the Persian literature as well. So I guess what I'm saying is that there are sort of four different ways that one can decipher this iconography or describe this iconography. And sometimes people said to me, well, which is the correct one? But the longer that I worked in Amediye and lived in the town and among the people and talked to people, the more I began to think it's, to me what's interesting is the story that each person brings to it. So for one person, it's the Nowruz story. For another person, it's the Shahnameh story. For another person, it's St. George. I mean, everybody is seeing these different tales within the same gate. The inscription that's associated with the gate simply tells us who the prince is. It doesn't tell us anything about the iconography. So we have to try to reconstruct that from our own knowledge of mythology and literature of the 13th century. So that's what we make of it. But it's interesting that also that some people said to me, are you sure that this is an Islamic gate? How can it be an Islamic gate? It has visual representation, including human figures on it. But yes, we are sure, and it's not unique. There are others. This region is actually pretty much full of these. I mean, here's another one at Sinjar. And then this is the one that was in Baghdad, but this one blew up during the First World War.
I want to carry on with the same line of questioning and perhaps actually suggest not just a longue durée but also a larger geographic extent for an understanding of the phenomenon that we are looking at, because it does have a beginning and an end. That is the appearance of figures and of dragons, of mythical creatures, is not just restricted to gates of palaces and castles, but it does appear on many other media, the most important of which is the coinage. We are in the post-Seljuk period, the fragmentation of the Seljuk Empire in this part of the world into smaller kingdoms, and each and every one of them is actually using figural representation that are borrowed from ancient sources. And the gates, I mean, I can add 6 or 7 more gates that are composite gates of elements that are picked up from antiquity and elements that are added. Nuruddin ibn Zengi, who's the brother of Amediye of Amediye, is famous for actually having done that in Harem, in Aleppo, and in Damascus. And in Damascus, he's not using figures anymore, probably because my city is much more conservative than the other cities. But this phenomenon requires a much, much, much more historical and perhaps actually even behavioral interpretation of what is going on. Because we have all of these small dynasties breaking a large empire, bringing in a new ethos, a new set of tastes, and using whatever is left from antiquity in articulating something that we don't have a precedent to in Islamic architecture or art. And it doesn't last much. With the rise of the Ayyubids, it disappears. I mean, at the beginning of the Ayyubids, it's still there, but then it disappears. So we're looking at something that happens between about 1090 and 1300. And it's quite widespread all over northern Iraq, northern Syria, southern Turkey today, and well into Iran, and then few examples in Egypt, because the same dynasties are going to filter into Egypt. So it seems to me that you have your finger on something that is small. I mean, this is not Aleppo, this is not Harem, and so on, but still it indicates that we need, as you are doing, some sort of a revisionist approach, but an approach that digs deep into historical sources, into migration patterns, into perhaps Turkic myths from Central Asia that they're bringing with them. But the most important one is the debate about a classical either revival or survival that is happening in this region. In art history, in Islamic art history, this debate still hasn't been resolved.
Hey, I mean, that's so helpful. Thank you very much. And yes, I think there's so much more work to be done on this topic. But this is fascinating that it's so widespread. And you said northern Iraq, but obviously also in Baghdad, because so it's not just the north. I mean, it's quite widespread in Mesopotamia, if we can use that colonial term. But that's fascinating, and I do think it needs a lot more historical work, and that there might even be Central Asian influence or other influence that I don't know about that might emerge.
Herzfeld's reading of the Baghdad one is very beautiful, because he thinks that this is the Caliph al-Nasir, who was not really happy with all of these fragmented Turkic dynasties, and that what we are seeing in here is the Khawarizm Shah on the one end and the Seljuk on the other, and al-Nasir is pulling their tongues. You'll see it in this image. But I think actually this is pure imagination.
That's a very imaginative, interesting but imaginative interpretation. which maybe is something to keep in mind, because then if a villager says to me, I see this as the story of Nowruz, then he's not doing something so different from Herzfeld, right?
So I just want to get back, because, if you go to Norway, the dragon embedded in vines is a typical Viking trope, Obviously, we're going to assume there weren't Vikings here, but
but we have movable objects. There are decorative arts, there are weapons, there are coins, there are decorative arts that do.
But we also have movable artisans.
Oh, yes.
Right, because we know that the Hagia Sophia, the capitals, were made by Sasanian artisans who converted to Christianity, right? And they made these beautiful basket motif with the things very similar to that. So there are also, artisans who move, right, and carry with them certain tropes of, that they just will use.
Yes.
And of course the bearded, mustached face, right? Every Roman portrayal of barbarians that coming out of Inner Asia is the bearded, mustached person, right? So, when I first looked at this, it looks like a Celtic warrior, So, I'm not. It's like you can't necessarily get from A to Z, right, with any of this, right? But the portability of certain imaginaries is also part of the struggle of interpretation. That's what I'm sort of getting at,
Yes, it's interesting to explore.
Thank you for the wonderful talk. I'm fascinated by your archaeology against the grain method, and I was wondering if you also, as you are intervening in the site and collecting these tales, are you also documenting the stories and they become part of that archive? And how are they? Where are they circulated then? Are they stored there? Do you have them in New York? Who can access those?
Yes. That's we're in the process of dealing with this problem, which is a problem, as you point out. So we have recorded a lot of things, and for example, the working method of the stonemasons, which I found to be truly fascinating, because it's just, silent and rhythmic, and they communicate without speaking. It's beautiful, really. So, of course, we videoed things like that. But also, there were these old people who came by and who we talked to, and we got their stories, but a couple of them would sing. They would just stand there and sing these old Kurdish songs that were so beautiful. And so, of course, we have those documented as well. And none of this is without people's permissions. We're always very careful to make sure that we have their permission, because we're very conscious of these issues and would not want to put people's images without their permission. For example, the last man that I showed you in the final image, I put down his name, Muhammad, and I did that because he actually asked me to. This one. Otherwise, I don't tag anybody. He specifically asked me to, so I'm putting his name here for posterity. So we, of course, we use a Columbia server because they don't have the capacity, but we make everything accessible to them there. I'm still not entirely happy with that, because internet access is spotty and not everybody has it. So I'm also working on making kind of printed albums that I can take and share with people. But this is a challenge, because they just don't have the server that we have at Columbia, and because we think that there's space and capability there that we can store all the information there, but really they should have it, And I hope that one day it can all be transferred there, but in the meantime they have direct access because they're partners with us in this every step of the way. So, I mean, we wanted to be the project. We wanted the project to be not just community-based, but a project that was in partnership between the Columbia team and the Kurdistan Archaeology Organization team. We worked really as one team. I don't think of us as two separate teams. And most people on the team were Iraqi. Most people, and even the ones who weren't Iraqi, could either speak Arabic or Kurdish or Turkish fluently, so we somehow managed to make it a very integrated project.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. It was fascinating. I have a question about your photographic archival documents, as I was surprised to see many, I mean not many, but people in them, and knowing that photograph was invented in like the 19th century European context, and the notion of imperialism as usually archaeologues were the one who were taking the photographs, if not always. And you said you work with photographs, but also like local stories from locals. And so I was wondering how to apprehend the people in this archival photographs, knowing the relationship between the gaze, the subject, and power.
Yes, that's a good question. The archival photographs are actually kind of limited because Walter Bachmann was there in 1911, and he did photograph the gate, but the photograph that I showed you didn't have a person in it, but he had other photographs with people in them. And I don't actually know what his relationship was to the person in his photograph. He has, for example, one photograph with a man next to one of the reliefs, and I don't know what his relationship was to that person, whether the person worked with him, whether it was just a local, and I have wondered about that. The 1940s photograph that I showed you, that was an Iraqi photograph, so that was not taken by a foreigner, it was taken by somebody in Iraq. And I've been trying to figure out who that man is, because I thought, is he from the city? Is he somebody who worked for the Directorate of Antiquities, say in Mosul, and came to Amediye? And I asked people around, like, do you recognize him? Thinking, well, is this somebody's grandfather? Or so this is something we also did, that when we had the older photographs, we tried to see if anybody knew who they were. But certainly this is an issue, because if you, I mean, I don't feel comfortable with going around photographing everybody and then putting it on our website, but it's really a bind, because on the other hand, if you show the monuments without people, then it gives a sense of museumification and monumentalization. And then you have those Orientalist arguments about antiquities being totally cut off from the population. The population have nothing to do with the historical past. But Amediye is, to me, a brilliant site for a case study, because the people live with this material day in and day out. It's part of their everyday experience. And it's not something that was excavated in the 19th century. This has been the situation since the Parthian era, and it has not changed. And they're there, they walk by them, they walk down, they walk up, they clean them, sometimes they put a basket of pomegranates next to them or what have you. But this is really their life, and somehow scholarship has denied them this, and this is what I was trying to tackle. So there is the issue of, the photograph and power, but there's also disciplinary paradigms and power, which I wanted to tackle.
We have time just for 2 last questions, so Matt and then
Yes, I'm really interested in what you were saying about the disciplinary divides between ancient Near Eastern studies and Islamic. And I mean, interestingly, people like Hertzfeld bridged that. He kind of had a long stretch of knowledge, but today it seems like that's frowned upon almost as oh, it's too general. You can't possibly. You have to dig deep. So I'm wondering what kind of future do you see in terms of working on sites like this, where there clearly is an uninterrupted chain, as it were, and also in terms of the iconography and the reliefs. Do you see the engagement as formal? Do you see it as deeper in terms of the function of the reliefs? And yeah, it's really interesting what you're saying.
Thank you. Yes, the divide is definitely stronger now, I think, than, these earlier scholars didn't feel compelled to stay in their own lane, so they delved into these other areas. But I think language skills are difficult, and that was part of the either you know Arabic or you know Akkadian, you don't know both. What's going to happen to the field in the future? I don't have a crystal ball, but if I did, I think what I would say is that it will change as more and more people from these countries start to respond to these disciplinary paradigms and start to do their own research and write and publish and work in the field. And I think that we will see changes simply because people from these areas are working on them. So I'm optimistic about that. And as for the iconography, I think that it's not just a formal. For me, it seems clear that it's not just a formal influence, because it seemed as though that they were deliberately trying to integrate the power of the ancient monument. For example, the very first relief next to the gate, this one, it's right as you come out of the gate to your right. So he's standing sentry. It's as if you have the guard of the gate, the guardian of the gate is standing sentry exactly where a sentry place would be, next to the gate. So I think this made sense, and there was no reason to remove it. So it was integrated. So there was the power of this ancient mythical figure that could protect the gate. So I think that that what these people were doing, what Professor Rabat mentioned, is that this kind of interest in antiquity at this period is something definitely requiring more scholarship, because this is not just accidental revival, or they're not just using them for structural purposes, because sometimes people say to me, oh, well, not here, but in other sites, people say to me, well, they took this column and they repurposed it because, well, it was easy for structural purposes. I don't really believe that. It's not, there are other things happening with these uses of the past that need to be explored and taken seriously. So I hope we'll do that in the future, that many people will, I don't mean our team, but other scholars should delve into this in the future as well.
Thank you so much for your interesting talk. My name is Heidi Shalabi. I'm a Spurs Fellow this year here in MIT, and I am from Egypt. And my question is about the new houses that you show us in the beginning of the presentation, and how those people,
you mean the ones on the upper left,
the new buildings, when they build this community or these houses for the people who's living there, how they get the water supply or the drainage or this stuff. I think these kind of utilities with the houses will damage the rest of the castle, or it's a serious threat for the rest of the monuments.
This has been one of our nightmares. I didn't tell you all of our challenges because if I would, we would be here for another week. One of the challenges that we had is precisely that the people in the town, there were always houses here, and we know that from historical accounts. These are newly built, but there were always houses here inside the citadel. But the drainage system, of course, because it's mountainous, it starts, every time it rains and it rains hard, there's this kind of channel that brings all the water from up above. So part of our work was trying to create a kind of a boundary for the drainage so that it wouldn't affect our reliefs or our stairway, because it was all coming down. So that was one of the things that we worked on as well. But this is a real challenge. Yes.
And did you found any other reliefs or structures inside the citadel, like the one that you found it in the outside?
There are many historical sites in the citadel that are fascinating. Not more Parthian reliefs, but for example, there's the Royal Cemetery of the Bahdinans. And this is fantastic cemetery, and with these fantastic domed tombs that I really think need to be, preserved and worked on and studied properly. And there are the ruins of a little bit of the ruins of the Bahdinan Palace, which again somehow got destroyed in the early 20th century, and there are these conflicting accounts as to why the Zibari Gate and the Bahdinan Palace were destroyed, and each account contradicts the other, so we're not really clear. There's a beautiful old mosque and minaret. There are some traditional houses cut with the same ashlar masonry that we have for the gate, so I think they're 13th century, just because they have this kind of strange cutting. It's not really, it's like a key. Juggled. You know it. Yeah, you have it in Jerusalem too, I think. So with that masonry, there are structures like that really ought to be preserved, and I would love to do more work on those. Then there is this, down in the valley, if you follow those stairs and you go down the stairs to the valley, there's an amazing madrasa of the same time period, more or less, and it's a ruin. And if you like romantic ruins, there's nothing more romantic than the ruin. It's called the Qubba Khan Madrasa, and it's just beautiful. And I heard that some French team may be taking over work there, and it should be preserved, but I very much hope that it doesn't become museumified or turned into a restaurant or all of these other things that can happen and do happen.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bahrani.